Hello my gravy babies! Welcome to the new installation of our JSI guide. On the previous video we created the stops for installing our JSI module into the JavaScript runtime, but we didn't actually write any JSI code. So today is the day where we actually write some JSI code. And this is very exciting, and this is actually the most valuable part that I'm going to be able to teach you. So let's just get to it. Now, on the previous video we left our module with our functions, but we didn't do anything to check if they were running. Of course, the JavaScript or React Native application, once it started, it tried to call the previous C++ code that was in there and it was crashing. So right now, the first thing I want to do is make sure that the code that we wrote before is actually running. In order to do this, I'm just going to go into the C++ file of our library, and I will just do a very simple log to console. For this, I will just include the IOStream library. I will also use another namespace to make our lives easier. And here I will just do cout installing JSI bindings. Very simple, nothing out of this world. And I will just recompile the project. Just put this up so you can see what I'm typing. And here, maybe your Xcode is not actually showing the same stuff that mine is. Once you start running your application with Xcode attached, here you will see this is the debugger window from Xcode, and if you click on this button, these are the logs from the device. So if I go right to the beginning, here I can see this is just the initial React Native or React login that our application is running. And here you can see that my message has actually been printed, which is super good. It means that we can now start writing our code. So we're going to start with the very basic stuff. We basically want to get a JSI function. Right? We want to register a function from C++ that can be called from JavaScript. Now, I'm just gonna live code this, so maybe I'll make some mistakes, but it's not too complicated. And we will start talking about all the JSI objects as we go along. So how do you register a JSI function? Everything is based on this runtime object. The runtime object, like I said, is the bridge between our C++ code, the native binary land, and the JavaScript runtime. So if I do RT and dot, you will see that Xcode actually does a lot of autocompletion for me, and there's a lot of options in here from the JavaScript runtime. One of the very interesting properties is the global one. So if I call rt.global, what this is going to return is the global scope of JavaScript, right? And in here, I can have some other properties, for example, or I can access some of the properties, for example, set property. So I am just going to select that one. Xcode is going to autocomplete for me. And then I have to pass. In a lot of the functions that we're going to see, we're going to have to repass the runtime over and over again. The first argument is going to be the runtime. That's fine. And then I have to set a property. This time I will just call it JSI multiplication. We're going to create a function that multiplies two numbers, pretty much what was there before. And for now, let's just leave this empty. We'll talk about it in a little minute. So let's think what this means. The global object on JavaScript is basically just an object that can be called from anywhere in your application, right? Here, for example, you have stuff like Let me think. On React Native, you might have the def variable, right? Or if you declare something, if you are on JavaScript and you do global my function, then you can just declare a global function, right? So then whenever you're in your code, you don't need to do global my function, etc. You can just do my function without needing to import it or anything, right? This is just the global scope of the entire JavaScript runtime. So basically what we're doing here is we are adding one property into this global object, which is called the JSI multiplication. And it's going to put this t value in there. So we haven't defined the value yet, but what's important is that you understand the mechanism. So now that we have access to our global context, we just need to create a value that we need to put in there, right? So it could be anything. It could be a number. It could be an object or whatever. But for now, we're just going to use the function because this is actually very interesting. This is something that we're going to use, or that you will probably use a lot when instantiating your JSI object. So how do you create a JSI function? Is by using the JSI function class. And I'm just going to call this multiply. Right? So this is the function that I need to insert on my global scope. Now, before I jump and actually create the multiply function, there's something that I need to be quite clear about. Currently, the documentation for the JSI doesn't really exist. What you're going to have to do, if you want to write it right now, is you're going to have to go through the source code of the JSI implementation. So here I have the React Native repository, and it's inside the React Common JSI folder. In this folder you have two files, the CPP file, which is the actual implementation of some of these methods, and the header file. So a lot of information that you're gonna need is going to be in these two files. Unfortunately, it's not gonna exist anywhere else, at least right now. So let's take a look, for example, into the header file. The header file contains the definition of a lot of the methods of the JSI. Here you can see, for example, we have the runtime, we have a pointer, we have a prop name, a symbol, a string, an object, an array, etc., etc., etc. Right? So I'm not going to go through all of it right now. And it's also very advanced C++, more than you will probably need to do simple bindings. But here, if you need something, you might get lucky and just do a simple search and you will find some property. But this already tells you a little bit about how the JSI objects behave. For example, you have a isArray function that's going to take an object and just returns a boolean, right? So you can check if a JSI object is any of the other or any specific class that you will need, and so on and so forth. This file it's a little bit long. If you go into the C++ file, the implementation file as well, here there's the actual implementation of translating between certain objects into a specific instance. How does the JSI do certain operations, and so on and so forth. So both of these files are going to be very, very useful. I'm not going to go over them. We will learn, or as we go right in our JSI code, we will learn more about this. So that's the basic idea. The JSI objects basically all conform to one single, let's say, superclass, which is the JSI value. The JSI value pretty much wraps every single property, and you can think of it as a generic JavaScript object, right? So whenever you send something to the JSI, the first type of all the data that you're going to send is going to be a JSI value. once inside of the C++ code, it is your job to cast down to more specific types, right? So if, let's say I have a value A and I'm expecting an int, what I need to do is cast this A as int. So first I have to check, is it a number, and so on and so forth, and then then I can actually do certain stuff. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's go back to our very basic function. So the thing is now, or the question is, how do we declare a function? And this is where the C++ guide that I did before is going to come very useful. Basically, you have a convenience method, which is called it's on the JSI namespace on the function once again, and it's called create from host function. So you're gonna see a lot about this host acronym prefix, right? You're gonna hear about host objects, host function. It doesn't really mean anything. It's not any specific concept. It just means that it's going to create a JSI function based on the language or the object that you're using to code your stuff, right? So in this case, this host function, it needs to be a C++ function, more specifically a Lambda function. If, let's say, one day the JSI supports Rust or I don't know, whatever language, then whenever you read the host prefix, you have to kind of put your mindset on this connection between the native elements of the language you're coding that need to be translated into JSI, into JavaScript objects. So that's like I said, a lot of these methods you need to pass over and over the runtime. So the first argument is just going to be our runtime. Then comes the name of this function. So I'm just going to use the class that I need to use to create this name. I'm just going to call it multiply, and my size is going to be, well, I actually don't need this size, I think. So let me check, what else do I need? Okay, so let's just think about it. Let's just think about what we're doing right now. If you remember what we did here, we talked about the global object, and we said we're going to inject a JSI multiplication property into that global object. Now here it might be a little bit confusing why we're using a different name, but you just kind of have to think whenever you're writing JSI code, it's like you're kind of writing JavaScript code. It's just a lot more indirect. So what happens is here, I'm going to define, or this somewhat equivalent of saying a function multiply, right? And here I am modifying the global object by saying JSI multiplication is my multiply function, right? So these two names don't need to be the same. It's just like writing JavaScript code. The declaration is not the same of the final object that I will have. So that's what I'm doing, right? Here I'm creating a JavaScript function from a bunch of properties. Next, I need to tell the JSI how many arguments is this function going to take. In our case, we're going to start with something very simple. We're just going to return a value into the JavaScript side of things. So it doesn't take any parameters. You can just call this function like this without anything. And then finally, we need to provide the implementation for our function. As stated, on C++, this works based on Lambda functions. So I would really recommend that you, if you haven't seen it yet, you go back into the C++ guide and watch the Lambda videos. I'm not going to explain too much about it. Basically, first we need to declare which variables are we going to capture from the context of the parent function. In this case, since I'm not using anything, I can just leave this empty. And inside of here, I need to pass certain or declare the parameters of my function that are actually going to be passed to it. I don't need to worry about it. Whenever you call this function from the JavaScript side, this stuff will be placed in there for you. So the first time is my runtime. The second thing that's going to be passed into this function is a array, or no, sorry, it's the this value, right? If you know a little bit about how JavaScript functions work, you know that each function does have a context. If you declare like this, it will have its own context. If you do a lambda declaration, like this, then you know that the context is inherited from the parent. So let's say, you know, if I call from my JavaScript side and this is inside of a React component, then in theory, I could get access to the React component context, all the variables inside of it via the this value, right? We're not gonna use it, but it still needs to be there, and it might be useful for you if at some point you decide to do anything about it. Next, we're going to get an array of arguments. And this is where the fun part starts. Like we said on the C++ guide, C-like arrays are not like JavaScript arrays, right? They're based on pointers, and we just have to traverse the memory as we go along to kind of retrieve all the elements of the array. So here we're just going to get a pointer to a JSI value, which is going to be the first element in the argument array. And then we are going to traverse the arguments to actually extract the values. Now we also get the size t parameter. Again, we talked about this, which is going to be the length of our value array. And finally, we can just close our lambda function and implement the functionality. Oh wait, sorry, I forgot one thing, which is the return type of my lambda. As you know, we on C++ is a very strictly statically typed language, so we cannot have functions without return values. Awesome. So what do we need to do? We said we are going to simply, for now, just return a value. So what I can do is I will just return a JSI value, and here I will just do 42. I need to fix all my missing columns. And that should be it. Expected. Probably don't need that one. Awesome. So I just recompile the application, and of course it starts, but it's still calling the old code. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go to VS Code. I'm already inside of my React Native application code, and here I am just going to modify this in order not to use our previous library implementation. So I'm just going to save this. I want to make sure that the application is not running, it's just not showing anything. So, like we said, we have registered our function inside of the global property. So if I would go ahead and let's say I do a console warn the global, what does that give me? You know what, let's just call it. It will be a lot more straightforward than just me trying to debug this. So I will just call the JSI multiplication call, and if we have done our work right, and there you go, we get 42. Now, there are a couple of things that we need to remark in here. First of all, you see that this is synchronous communication. Unlike the old bridge, where everything got batched, translated to JSON, and then sent to the native site, here I'm actually directly calling the C++ function, right? Which means it is synchronous. There are ways to do a synchronous job, but one needs to be careful. You need to initialize your code on the C++ side a little bit differently, and you need to work with the JavaScript call invoker in order to register a callback, etc., etc. Let's not worry too much about that right now. So that was our first, let's say, encounter with JSI code. Now that we have a function that actually runs, we're going to start exploring a little bit about how do we cast values, how do we create objects, how do we create arrays, how do we throw errors, etc., etc. And afterwards, after we have all that knowledge, we can actually import SQLite, and we will start slowly creating all the code to bridge SQLite into the JavaScript side of things. Thanks a lot for watching, and please subscribe.